Grace never imagined her life would look like this. At 32, she thought she'd be married, raising a child or two, maybe running a small faith-based business from home. Instead, she was jobless, single, and back in her childhood bedroom after her apartment lease ended and her savings dried up. The room looked the same, but Grace didn't. She had changed. A dull ache settled in her chest each morning as she stared at the ceiling, wondering how she got here. And more painfully, why God had let her stay here. Grace had been raised in the church. She sang on worship teams, led youth Bible studies, even spoke at retreats. People said she had a calling. She believed them, until life unraveled. First came the job layoff. Her dream job at a nonprofit suddenly ended due to budget cuts. Then came the health scare, a sudden diagnosis that forced her into surgery and months of recovery, alone. Then, the silence. Not from people. The money did fade away when things got messy. But silence from God. Grace prayed, cried, begged, waited, but heaven didn't answer. One night, curled up under a pile of old quilts, she whispered, "Jesus, did you forget me?" No thunder, no dream, no scripture magically highlighted, just stillness. Her faith began to bend under the weight of so many almosts and not yets. She watched as friends posted engagements, promotions, testimonies. She clapped for them, smiled. But inside she whispered, "What about me?" The most painful part wasn't the waiting. It was not knowing what she was waiting for anymore. Grace still went to church, still lifted her hands during worship, but it felt hollow. She knew all the right scriptures, knew that faith wasn't based on feelings. But when prayers go unanswered long enough, even the strongest heart begins to wonder. One Sunday, the pastor said, "God is never late. He's just preparing the miracle." Grace almost laughed. She wanted to believe it, but the words felt like air, weightless, drifting. What miracle? She had no signs, no prophetic dreams, no encouragements. Just an aching silence. She decided that afternoon to stop asking, stop expecting. She wouldn't stop loving God, but she would stop hoping. It hurt too much. Then something strange happened. In her dreams, she started seeing a door. Always the same. A narrow, wooden door covered in ivy with a gold handle. It never opened. It just waited. She'd wake up with her heart racing. Was it symbolic? A message? She wasn't sure, but something in her stirred. One evening, Grace took a walk. The old part down the street, where she used to journal under the big willow tree. She sat on the same bench, opened an empty notebook, and wrote only 4 words. "Do you see me?" Just as she wrote it, a gust of wind blew the page. She reached to catch it, and her eyes landed on a woman walking toward her, older, dressed in a long blue coat. The woman smiled as she passed and said gently, "God hasn't forgotten you, sweetheart." Then she was gone. Grace sat frozen. She hadn't spoken to anyone. Was that coincidence? Or confirmation? That night, Grace lay awake. Her mind replayed the words again and again. God hasn't forgotten you. Something cracked open. Not a miracle, but a shift. The next morning, she felt led to open her Bible. It fell to Isaiah 49. Her eyes landed on verse 15. Can a mother forget the baby at her breast? Though she may forget, I will not forget you. Tears welled up in her eyes. I will not forget you. It was the first verse in months that felt personal, felt real. Grace whispered, "Okay, maybe you do see me." That day, she got an email. A small organization was looking for a temporary admin. Nothing fancy, but they needed help urgently. She hadn't applied. They had found her resume on an old database. Grace stared at the screen. Coincidence again? Or something more? She took the job. The pay was small, the hours inconsistent. But something inside her told her it wasn't about the job. It was about obedience. What if this small assignment was part of something bigger? At work, she met people with soft hearts. A coworker named Rachel who had also walked through a long waiting season. A supervisor who randomly said, "God told me you have something powerful to offer." Grace felt her heart stir again. Tiny whispers, quiet echoes, like God was leaving breadcrumbs. One night, Grace pulled out her journal. This time, she wrote, Lord, I don't need to know when. I just need to know you're still writing. For the first time in months, peace settled over her like a blanket. No promises, no booming voice, just a gentle sense that maybe, just maybe, Jesus hadn't forgotten her. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know yet, was that behind the scenes, something had been in motion all along. Connections she hadn't made, opportunities she hadn't seen, people she hadn't met. And soon, the miracle she stopped hoping for would walk right into her life. But for now, she would sleep and dream again of the door, still closed, but no longer feared. She was beginning to believe it would open. The office was quiet when Grace arrived that Monday morning. The walls were off-white, and the furniture was dated, but the people were kind. It wasn't a dream job, but something about being needed, even in a small way, felt like healing. Her role was simple: answer emails, manage a few schedules, and update spreadsheets. But every task gave her something she'd forgotten she needed: purpose. One afternoon, Rachel, her coworker, sat down across from her at the lunch table. You ever feel like you're stuck in a waiting room with no idea what you're even waiting for? Rachel asked, half laughing, half serious. Grace blinked, stunned. That's exactly how I feel. Rachel smiled gently. Me too. But lately, I'm starting to wonder if the waiting is the miracle. Grace tilted her head. What do you mean? I mean, maybe the transformation doesn't happen after the waiting ends. Maybe it happens in it. That night, Grace sat in her room thinking about Rachel's words. Was it possible? Was the silence not a punishment, but a process? She opened her Bible again, more out of curiosity than discipline. This time it opened to John 11, the story of Lazarus. She'd read it 100 times. But tonight something stood out. When he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Jesus waited. He loved Lazarus, and he still delayed. Not because he didn't care, but because he was preparing something greater than healing. He was preparing a resurrection. Grace sat back, heart pounding. What if Jesus wasn't ignoring her? What if he was waiting so that the miracle would carry more glory than she imagined? A few days later, Grace got an unexpected invitation. Rachel had invited her to a small worship night at a local home church. Grace hadn't sung in a while, not since her voice had been silenced by disappointment. But something inside urged her to go. The house was small but filled with warmth. A handful of people sat on couches with guitars, tambourines, and open Bibles. The moment the music started, Grace felt something crack. She didn't know the words. She didn't have expectations. She just closed her eyes. And in that quiet moment, she heard it, not audibly, but in her spirit. I never left you. Tears streamed down her face. That sentence, just 5 words, felt like oxygen to her soul. After worship, a woman approached her, older, with kind eyes and a voice full of compassion. You don't know me, but I saw you during worship. And I felt God whisper, tell her I've seen her tears. She thinks I've forgotten, but I'm preparing something sacred. Grace broke. How could she know? Unless God was speaking. In the weeks that followed, subtle changes began happening. She began journaling again. She started praying, not begging, but simply sitting in stillness. She even agreed to sing backup at the next house worship night. Not because everything was fixed, but because her heart was learning to trust again. One morning, Rachel brought in coffee and a stack of papers. Hey, she said, our team is expanding, and I recommended you for a new position. It's part-time for now, but more creative, writing and media. You'd be great. Grace blinked. Me? Yeah, you're already doing more than you realize. The offer came 2 days later. Better pay, a flexible schedule, and, perhaps most exciting, purpose that aligned with her passion. She took the job, and it felt like a seed had sprouted. Something was growing. One night, she had the dream again. The same wooden door, but this time it was slightly open. Inside, she saw only light, and a voice whispered, it's almost time. She woke up breathless, but not afraid, because something deep in her spirit had shifted. She no longer feared the silence. She had learned to listen in it. One Sunday, the pastor's sermon was on Exodus, about God leading the Israelites out of Egypt. He said something that stuck with her. Sometimes God delays the destination to develop the depth. That was it. She wasn't forgotten. She was being formed. Her faith wasn't just surviving the waiting, it was being refined in it. She began walking more, talking with God during quiet strolls. She noticed beauty in small things. A blooming tree, a kind stranger, the way wind moved through leaves like a whisper from heaven. God was everywhere, not loud, but always present. Her journal pages filled quickly. Jesus, I still don't know the full picture, but I'm no longer afraid of the pieces. If the wait is where you build miracles, then I will wait in worship. What Grace didn't know was that the greatest miracle wasn't just ahead. It was already unfolding. Jesus hadn't been still. He had been moving pieces, opening doors, healing old wounds, and weaving a testimony. Not just for her, but for those she would one day speak to, sing over, and write for. The silence wasn't punishment. It was preparation. And now, the door was about to swing wide open. Grace stood in front of the mirror, not to check her hair or makeup, but to see if she still recognized the woman in the reflection. Something had changed, not on the outside, but deep beneath the surface. She no longer looked like the girl who thought silence meant abandonment. She looked like a woman who had learned to wait with faith. The new job was more than a paycheck. It was a platform. Her supervisor, Elena, turned out to be more than a manager. She was a mentor. You don't even realize what you carry, Grace, Elena said one afternoon over coffee. There's a depth in you, like someone who's been through fire but came out with gold. Grace smiled softly. She hadn't told Elena much. Just enough. But somehow, God kept confirming the same thing. The wait had done something holy in her soul. That week, a small assignment arrived. Write a story for the organization's upcoming online devotional. Grace hesitated. She hadn't shared her writing in years. But as she stared at the blank page, something poured out, effortless, honest, raw. The story was called, When It Feels Like God Forgot. Within a week of being published, it went viral. Hundreds of messages poured in. I needed this today. I thought I was the only one. You wrote the words I didn't know how to say. Grace was stunned. God hadn't just been preparing her for survival. He had been preparing her for impact. One afternoon, as she walked past the park where she'd once cried out, "Do you see me?" she heard music, live music. A small community outreach was happening. Free food, acoustic worship, testimonies. Something nudged her spirit, stay. She sat on the grass, and after a few minutes, a young woman began sharing her story. My name is Hope, she said, and for a long time, I thought God forgot me. Grace sat up straighter, but then I realized, Hope continued, he wasn't ignoring me. He was protecting me from what I couldn't yet see, and preparing me for what I couldn't yet imagine. Tears filled Grace's eyes. Those words, they echoed her own. After the event, Grace found Hope by the snack table. Your story. She started, voice trembling. It was like hearing my own. Hope smiled. Funny, I was thinking the same when I read your devotional online. They hugged like sisters who had walked through the same fire, unknowingly on parallel paths. That night, Grace had another dream. The door was wide open now. Inside, not just light, people, smiling, welcoming, radiant. And a voice said, step into what I've prepared. She woke up and wept. The dream was no longer a mystery. It was a mandate. A few days later, Elena walked into Grace's office. We're launching a new project, she said. A podcast. Stories of faith through silence. And we want you to host it. Grace froze. I've never done anything like that. But you've lived it, Elena replied. And that's what matters. Grace didn't answer right away. She prayed, waited, and then whispered, yes. The podcast launched 2 months later, in the waiting. The first episode was Grace's testimony. She shared everything. The job loss, the silence, the doubts, the dream of the door, and how God had slowly, quietly, been preparing the miracle she never saw coming. It was raw, vulnerable, and real. Within a week, the episode had 10,000 downloads. People wrote from hospitals, prison cells, dorm rooms. They were waiting too, and Grace had become their voice. Then one morning, her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. A text. "I've been trying to find you. Can we talk?" Jacob. Her heart stopped. Jacob. The man she once thought she'd marry. The one who walked away in her season of loss. Too afraid to stay. Too overwhelmed to fight. She hadn't spoken to him in nearly 2 years. Her hands trembled. She didn't know what to say. So she said nothing. That night, she prayed, "Jesus, if you're bringing this back, don't let it be a test. Let it be redemption." She felt no fear, just peace, because now she knew she didn't need a person to complete the miracle. The miracle was already happening in her, but if Jacob's return was part of it, she would wait and watch with open hands. Over the next week, they talked, cautiously, honestly. Jacob had changed. He had gone through his own wilderness. And now, standing on the other side, he realized what he'd walked away from. "You were the bravest person I knew," he said, "and I didn't have the courage to stand beside you. But I've been praying, and if there's any chance, I'd like to rebuild." Grace didn't answer right away, not out of anger, but because she had learned some doors open because God opens them, not because someone knocks. So she whispered, "Let's start with friendship. If God wants more, he'll build it." And Jacob agreed. The miracle wasn't one thing. It wasn't a job, or a relationship, or a platform. It was everything. It was the restoration of joy, the return of peace, the revival of purpose. Grace had been forgotten by people, but never by Jesus. He had been building the miracle slowly, quietly, perfectly. And now, it was only just beginning. The rain came unexpectedly that morning. Grace stood by her window, coffee in hand, watching drops trace patterns on the glass like a gentle reminder from heaven. Beautiful things still came in stormy seasons. It had been a year since she took that small admin job, a year since she cried in her childhood room, asking if Jesus remembered her. So much had changed since then. Her podcast had grown rapidly, and the waiting was now reaching thousands across the world. People shared their stories of grief, faith, and silent trust. Grace became a gentle voice in dark places, reminding others that the silence of God was never abandonment but transformation. Jacob had kept his promise. They remained friends. Slowly, intentionally. There was no rush. This time, there was space for healing, for truth, for Jesus to remain at the center. One evening, after a local church event, they sat beneath the stars. "You know," Jacob said quietly, "if you'd gotten everything you prayed for the first time, you wouldn't have discovered the woman you are now." Grace nodded. "Neither would you." She smiled, not because the miracle was Jacob or the job or the podcast. The miracle was her becoming. 2 months later, a publishing company reached out. They had discovered her podcast and devotional work. They wanted her to write a book, one for people walking through seasons of silence, called Prepared in the Pause. Grace stared at the email for an hour. She had written that line in her journal only weeks ago. She whispered, "Okay, Jesus, I see you." Writing the book felt like therapy and worship at the same time. Page by page, she poured the pain and the glory. She told the whole story, not just the victory, but the valley. She included the night she asked, "Do you see me?" The dream of the door. The stillness that once scared her, but had now become her sanctuary. And when a manuscript was done, she cried, not because it was over, but because she saw the miracle in full view. She had lived it. The book launched to an audience hungry for truth. It didn't just succeed, it changed lives. Letters flooded in from readers. "Your story saved me. I thought I was alone. Now I wait with hope." Grace realized that Jesus didn't just prepare a miracle for her. He prepared a miracle through her. One morning, as she prayed near her favorite park bench, she heard the voice again, soft but unmistakable. "Now, walk through the door." She opened her eyes and stood. She didn't need to see the dream anymore. She was living it. That afternoon, Jacob asked to meet. They sat beneath the willow tree, just like they had in younger days. "I know we started again as friends," he said gently, "but I've prayed, I've grown, and I still love you. I've never stopped." Grace felt peace, not butterflies. Peace that only comes when something is right. "Then let's walk through the door together," she said. And for the first time, The dream and reality became one. A year later, their wedding was small but beautiful. She wore a simple white dress. He waited with tears in his eyes. But the most powerful moment was when the pastor said, "Grace, you thought Jesus forgot you." But in truth, he was preparing this moment all along. They didn't promise a perfect life. They promised to seek Jesus together, no matter the season. The podcast reached its 1 millionth listener the following spring. The book became a bestseller. But more than the numbers, Grace cherished the handwritten letters, the quiet prayers, the anonymous emails that said, "Because of you, I didn't give up." She once thought the miracle would come in fireworks and signs. Instead, it came in whispers, in obedience, in the courage to keep waking up and trusting. One evening, she stood before a crowd at a women's conference. She was the keynote speaker. The lights were bright. The crowd was full. But she didn't talk about success or fame. She told them about the girl who cried in her childhood bedroom, who questioned God's silence, who almost gave up. Then she said, "Jesus didn't forget me. He was building something I couldn't see. And if you're still waiting, that doesn't mean he's finished. It might mean he's just getting started." A standing ovation followed. But Grace knew the applause didn't matter. The miracle had already happened, not because her life was full now, but because she had discovered Jesus never left. Even in silence, even in waiting,